Hello everybody. What is the greatest decade for cars? It's one of the all-time great pub debates, isn't it? Along with Godzilla versus Saruman, who would win in a fight. Now, on the one hand, it's a very, very easy question to answer because, for most people, it's whatever decade you grew up with. Much like who's your favourite James Bond? It's whichever one was in the cinemas when you were that impressionable age. And decades on, no matter how bad the special effects, how terribly, terribly awful and sexist the dialogue is, it doesn't matter. That's your Bond and no one can ever take it from you. But in the world of cars, I think it's a little more complicated. And though, yes, the 90s is the decade that I grew up with, in this video, I am going to make the case for why I think it is the greatest decade for cars ever. And then, once you've heard me out, I look forward to joining you in the comment section to see what's your favourite decade and your reasoning behind it. This should be a good one. Enjoy. I've been thinking about making a video along these lines for quite some time, but there was a specific moment the other day where I thought, right, it has to be done. I was out filming some new drive-bys with both this and my Toyota Celica GT4. I was stood in the lay-by as the Toyota went past Ferrari in the corner of my vision. I looked at them both and I just thought, wow, they are absolutely sensational. Nothing in the past 30 years has happened to dull their appeal. And in fact now, perhaps more than ever, they are desperately cool cars. Not just to look at, but also to drive. And I thought, yeah, wow, I'm so lucky to be able to own this pair of 90s icons. And then it dawned on me, there's a lot of cars from the 90s that I really, really like. In fact, presently, I am fortunate enough to own 4 cars, all of which in some way, shape or form I would deem iconic, and all of which came from that glorious decade. You have on the one end my Citroën BX, which, though truthfully is a product of the 1980s, it's a 1990 registered car. Then in the middle you have the Celica GT4, the mighty star of the rally stage and probably the most infamous of all cars that I own. Next up you have this, the Ferrari 550 Maranello, dubbed by not just St. Clarkson herself but also others as one of the greatest handling cars of all time. And then at the other end we have my Honda S2000, which, like the Citroën, is a bit of a token entrant because, strictly speaking, that is a 2003 car, but as a model, the S2000 landed at the tail end of the decade in 1999. And it's not just the cars of this decade that I love either. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, I've been to the cinema no fewer than 3 times to see a trio of fabulous action films on the big screen, each of which for the first time. First up there was GoldenEye, which I firmly believe to be one of the best Bond films ever. Then we have The Rock, and car geeks tell me what connects those 2 films, a fabulous action extravaganza which is not just a highlight of Michael Bay's career, but I would argue also Nicolas Cage's and Sean Connery's. And then a few days ago I went to go and see Demolition Man, which, while very flawed in a great many ways, is still, I think, a charming movie and just a wonderful throwback. It's a fabulous thing, and to be able to see these films on the big screen is an absolute treat. And clearly I'm not alone in my thinking, because the screening for The Rock has to be one of the busiest that I've attended in quite some time. In fact, the last time I saw more people in a theatre, it was for Oppenheimer. But enough of cinema and back to my other passion. cars. What is it about 90s ones that makes them so great? Well, where do we begin? I think let's start with the way that they look, because the 90s was another decade of great change. I'm not saying that the 80s didn't have its fair share of great designs, and in fact there are many brilliant, iconic cars that came from that decade. The Lotus Turbo Esprit, one of my all-time favourites. The Audi Quattro, the Ferrari Testarossa. The 80s has got its fair share of brilliant cars and iconic designs. And this is not a video designed to trash any other decade. No, 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 no. Far from it. Those that know me will know that I celebrate the automobile in all of its many glorious forms. But I do think it is fair to say that in the 1980s we saw a continuation of that 1970s school of design, which was sort of flat panels and cheap bits, plastic replacing chrome, rubber replacing metal. It was all getting a little bit depressing. And though today you look at something like, say, an Audi Quattro, and it is unashamedly 1980s, it just doesn't have the beauty, the curvaceous lines of a 1960s or 1950s car. But in the 1990s, those beautiful lines made a comeback, and you have a selection of gorgeous cars to choose from. Take this, for example, the 550, an unashamed update of the iconic front-engine Ferrari V12s of the 1960s, like the 275 GTB, to some extent, I suppose, the later Daytona. Japan also followed this trend with a great many of its cars. So the RX-7 went from, again, a very angular-looking thing to one that was far more curvaceous and shapely for the FD generation. The Mark IV Supra did exactly the same thing, went from being all points and things to curves, beautiful lines. It became a far more feminine design. The oft-forgotten Mitsubishi 3000 GT, or GTO, another car that today, though not the prettiest ever made, I think doesn't get the credit that it deserves. Sure, the Nissan Skyline R34 remained relatively boxy, but it's also, I think, a great looking car. The same also could be said of the Honda NSX, which also made its debut at the very end of the 1980s, but most would consider a 90s car. Fantastic, great looking thing. Even the Americans had a go at the old make a car look pretty game with the Dodge Viper, and though if you do get up close to an early one, they're a little bit wonky in the way they're put together, you cannot help but leave with a sense of adoration for the boldness of that car's proportions. In fact, if there were any in the list I've just mentioned that deserves praise for being so shameless in how retro it wanted to be, it's that. A car that was genuinely bombastic in just about every possible way. At the very top end of the market, this decade also saw what now you might term the hypercar. So from Ferrari, you had the F50, potentially the road car with the closest link to Formula One we're ever likely to see, a carbon fiber tub with a Formula One derived engine bolted right to the back of it. And though I know it's gone on to become a very controversial car, and one that I'm almost certain to never get to drive, and someone actually did offer me a go, I just couldn't insure it because, funnily enough, my insurance company didn't fancy a £3 million car. But never mind, I've sat in one, and you know what, in some ways, that was enough. Very, very special thing. From Lamborghini, we then had the Diablo, something I have had the pleasure of sampling, and that is a wonderful, wonderful car. And of course, that decade also gave us what many consider to be the ultimate supercar, the McLaren F1. A brilliantly, wonderfully, crazily single-minded car that really could only have come from somewhere like McLaren. And not only was it the sort of thing that we were all convinced straight away we'd never see again, we'd never seen before, and no one really had even heard of. That was a statement car. Nothing, I think, really ever came close to the effect that had until really the Bugatti Veyron. And on that note, the 90s also gave us an arguably even madder supercar than the McLaren F1, the Bugatti EB110. And as it happens, Jason Camissa over at Haggerty, doing his Revelation series, has just done a great video on that. So if you want to know more about the EB110, check that out, because he said lots of stuff I had no idea about. Great video, I really enjoyed that series. Even Jaguar got in on the action with the XJ220, another car I am lucky enough to have driven, appearing, albeit in somewhat trimmed down guise compared with the car it was supposed to be. That unfortunately became one of the decade's most infamous failures, a car that promised much and delivered relatively little, that today I think really does deserve to be held in somewhat higher regard than it is. But across the board, cars were generally prettier. The proportions were better. They were smaller. They felt a little bit more compact. They felt more space efficient. Big cars weren't really that big. And let's just park all the super and hypercars for a moment. Regular, ordinary cars were good and good looking. Look at a BMW E39 or E46 or even E34. And yes, okay, E34 started life in the 1980s, but it was alive for a lot of the 1990s, and the E39 is definitely a product of the 90s, as is the E46. Fantastic car, that. I do also believe the E36 landed at more or less the start of the decade, so let's count that as a very much 90s car too. Sensational things, each and every one of them. Audi were on form too, and yes, their styling language was changing again from that boxy kind of squared off look of the 80s to a more rounded one, which for me I think peaked in the RS2. What a mega car that is. And how could I have got this far without mentioning Porsche? So the 911 was already an ancient car, and I suppose you could make an argument it's not an 80s car, it's not a 70s car, it's a 60s car, but it did change over the years. And both the 964 and 993 in their own ways are great cars, and even, controversial I know, I think the 996 is a good looking car, particularly in turbo, guys. I know nobody liked it when it arrived, and a lot of people still don't, but I think that is an awesome car. And the Boxster, well, the Boxster's gone on to become one of their most important models, and if you want a great sports car at an affordable price, you'd struggle to beat it. Best of all though, look at just about any car from any manufacturer at the time, be it BMW, Bugatti, Volvo, or Volkswagen. They all looked different. They all had a genuine identity about them. And they were experimenting. They were doing funky stuff. Lotus came out with the Elise. Renault came out with the Renault Sport Spider, tragically closely to the Lotus. But you also had stuff like the Clio, the Megane, doing their own thing. There were really, really cool cars out there at affordable prices. Ford Mondeo, ST200, later ST220. Jaguar brought out the new X100 generation XK, a style icon, and yes, underneath again a deeply, deeply flawed car, but wonderful to look at. Wow. All right then, let's get on to the other thing I love about 90s cars. The engines. Oh, the engines. They were so special. And really for a lot of the same reasons that I've just said for styling. First off, the variety. Today, you buy a car, chances are 4-cylinder, if you're lucky, maybe 6, possibly even 8, and almost certainly with a turbocharger attached and maybe a hybrid system too. But back then, things were very different. Turbocharging was really the domain of either diesels, which you generally bought not even for their economy, but just their durability, and everybody knew they weren't sexy, or they were for Japanese performance cars, or something like a 911 turbo. Turbochargers were sexy. There was a good reason people would put a turbo decal on the side of their car, because it was meant to be more exciting and not less. But for anything without a turbo, where, yeah, sure, your regular car would have a 4-cylinder, getting something with a 6 would be relatively easy. There were plenty of 8s about, and this was also the decade where manufacturers started to go a little bit crazy. This continued over into the 2000s, which you could argue had even crazier engines, with the likes of the W8, W12 and W16 from VW's group, and of course a whole bunch of other stuff too. But again, if you want to look at sexy stuff, you have the McLaren F1 and its V12, you have Ferrari and their many V12s, Lamborghini with the continuation of their V12, but also you've got the iconic BMW Straight 6. At the other end of things, the decade also saw the introduction of the venerable 1.8 turbo unit, as seen in a whole bunch of VW products, including, say, the also new for the 90s Audi TT. Today, that is regarded by many as a great engine. And one thing that set it apart, 5 valves per cylinder, which a few companies had a go at the time, including Ferrari, because for the 355, you saw a 5 valve per cylinder, naturally aspirated V8 that revved to over 8,500 RPM in 1994. And it sounded damn good while it did it. The engine here in the 550, 5.5 litres, 48 valves of Italian glory. No, it doesn't sound quite as good as the 355, but then I've been to operas, which are less tuneful than a 355. Actually, that's a total lie and a complete Clarksonism. I have never been to the opera. But I have heard a lot of 355s, and if the opera was just one of those going around for 2 hours, I'd have a season ticket. 5 really did seem to be the number of the decade, because not only did we have the banned 5, you also had 5 valve per cylinder cars and a whole glut of 5-cylinder cars. The Italians went really nutty for it, and Fiat, Alfa Romeo all experimented. Lancia did, I think, as well. And a 5-cylinder is a really, really cool power plant. Volvo, I'm pretty confident, would also have had a 5 in that decade, because later on Ford also pinched it and put it in some of the hotter Focus. Subaru, how could I forget Subaru? Them and Mitsubishi, they were having a good old dust-up in the 90s. And so if you wanted a performance car, you didn't have the budget for a Ferrari, Porsche, Lamborghini, Maserati or Mercedes, well, they were just about the fastest things going. Nearly 300 horsepower, 2-litre, turbocharged 4-cylinder, when turbo was sexy. They were cool things. And that noise a Subaru makes, well, that's iconic, isn't it? Not loved by everybody, because as we all know, it heralds the approach of a yob, but it's a great soundtrack. And a lot of cars from the 90s sounded pretty epic, although I should be fair and balanced here and say that many of the cars you have heard from that era, well, they didn't have standard exhausts on, so they didn't actually sound like that out of the factory gates. And one of the other things that I really appreciate about 90s cars is it was this wonderful convergence of development and regulation. Cars were getting better, computer-aided design and computers themselves were beginning to make more of an appearance. And cars were getting better in terms of performance, but also reliability. However, the regulations hadn't got to the point where they were beginning to be restricted by them. This is why you can have stuff like this 550 with a V12 up the front and an impossibly low bonnet line. This is one of the reasons that cars today do look a little bit samey. It's not just because all of the styling departments have gone home or been outsourced to China. It's because there are regulations and restrictions they have to meet, and this means they're always going to look a little bit samey. But wind the clock back 20 years ago or so, and a BMW, Mercedes and an Audi, they looked different, they had different engines, and they drove different. Different drive configurations, different gearboxes, they all had a different flavour, different cars for different people. Under the bonnet, carburetors were becoming increasingly rare, meaning cars were more economical, more powerful, and more reliable. And I know there'll always be people that go misty-eyed about carbs and couldn't give a hoot about fuel injection, but I'm not Ian Tyrrell. I don't really care that much for carbs. I want a car that starts. I also appreciate the fact that in this decade we saw the arrival of things like ABS across the board. Traction control also started to make an appearance. This car has it, but it's very basic. But with 420 pounds-feet of torque on tap and a cable throttle, I'm kind of thankful for it, because in conditions like this, it's nice to know there is a little bit of a safety net. You shouldn't really trust it though, because it's one of those safety nets where the gaps in the rope are about ½ a metre, so you can slip through if you try hard enough. But what it does mean is that you can get in something like this, drive it in conditions like this, and enjoy yourself, not be all that worried. If you want to, you can daily drive a 90s car fairly easily. And I'm sure there's somebody watching that daily drives a car from the 1930s. But just because you do it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. Of course, things aren't all brilliant. Lots of 90s cars have started to rust. Some of the electronics also got to the point where, yes, it was smart enough to tell you that there was a problem, but not smart enough to tell you what the problem actually is. This is very true for the likes of, say, the BMW 8 Series, but by and large, they're generally fairly easy cars to maintain. They are mechanically and electronically considerably simpler than the cars that followed, and also a bit better built and more reliable than the cars that preceded them. They really are, to me, something of a sweet spot. Like I said at the beginning, though I can think of a great many cars from lots of places around the world over a whole number of decades. In fact, let's face it, the entire century and a bit that the automobile has been in existence. It is the 90s, I think, which I would describe as the peak for a great many cars. Chevrolet Corvette, the C5, what a revelation that is! Fantastic car! And I know that's a strange thing to hear coming from a European, and most people here wouldn't even know which one the C5 is, but I've driven a Z06. Sensational. If I could, I'd have one. It's genuinely brilliant. As is this, as is a 355. As are a great many Volvos of the day, as are many Volkswagens, as are many BMWs, as is the Lotus Elise. The 90s was a damn good decade to be a petrol head. Hop in the comments and tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong. In either case, thanks for watching. Don't forget, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye. Next week on JayEmm on Cars, my Ferrari 550 breaks down and leaves me stranded on the A14. No, really, it did.